The moment everything changes, a man walks through a set of steel doors that he is not running. He is not crying. His face is stone. Behind him, those doors seal shut with a sound that has ended thousands of lives. Not by death, by disappearance. The year is 2003. The place is Pelican Bay State Prison, Crescent City, California. A facility sitting so deep in the redwoods of Northern California that most Americans don't know it exists. And the men inside say that's exactly the point. This man, referred to in court documents as Marcus W., is 24 years old. He has just been classified as a security housing unit inmate. Not for what he did on the outside, for what prison officials believe he represented inside, that he would not see general population again for 11 years. Over 80,000 Americans are held in solitary confinement on any given day, according to the ACLU. But Marcus's story is not unique. It is one thread in a much larger, much darker fabric. Every single day in the United States, approximately 1.9 million people wake up inside a cage. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, America incarcerates more people per capita than any nation on earth. More than Russia, more than China, more than any authoritarian regime the evening news will warn you about tonight. And inside those walls, a world exists that most people never see. A world with its own economy, its own law, its own hierarchy, its own war. Some men enter prison and they break. Quietly, without anyone noticing until it's too late. Some men enter prison and they adapt, reshaping themselves into something unrecognizable, just to make it through the week. And then there are the ones this documentary is about, the ones who refused. Not because they were fearless, but because the alternative, becoming what the system wanted them to become, was something they could not live with. What you are about to watch is not fiction. Every incident described in this documentary is drawn from court records, federal investigations, first-hand testimony, and documented human rights reports. The names of some individuals have been changed for legal or safety reasons, but the events are real. And before we go any further, before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The rules no one tells you. The first thing they don't tell you about prison is that the official rules barely matter. There's a second rulebook, unwritten, unspoken, enforced by violence, by silence, by reputation, and by the very real possibility that if you get it wrong on your first day, you might not make it to your second. According to a 2014 Department of Justice investigation into New York City's Rikers Island facility, 77% of serious injuries recorded at the facility were the result of use of force, not inmate-on-inmate violence. The guards, the ones who were supposed to be keeping the peace. But this is not simply a story about corrupt officers or brutal institutions, though both feature heavily in what follows. This is a story about survival as a form of resistance. What does it take to survive the most dangerous prisons in America? We will walk through 6 chapters to find out. We will enter Angola, Louisiana, a former slave plantation turned maximum security prison, where some inmates have lived inside those walls for decades without ever breathing free air again. We will go inside ADX Florence, Colorado, the federal supermax facility nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies, where men are locked in 7 by 12-foot cells for 23 hours a day, sometimes for years without end. We will examine Rikers Island, a facility so plagued by violence that the city of New York has been under a federal consent decree since 2015 and is still fighting to close it. We will document the Pelican Bay hunger strikes of 2011 and 2013, when over 30,000 California inmates refused food simultaneously in one of the largest coordinated acts of prisoner protest in American history. And we will tell the stories of the men who lived through it, and what survival actually cost them. Stay with us, because by the time this documentary ends, you will never think about the American justice system the same way again. Fearless inmate in America, surviving dangerous prisons, entering the belly of the beast. The bus ride is the last moment of ordinary life. For most men arriving at a maximum security prison in America, the journey begins in silence. Wrists chained to a belly chain, ankles shackled, seated in rows on a transport vehicle with blacked-out windows so you cannot see where you are going, only that you are going deeper, deeper into the system, deeper away from everything you have ever known. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, more than 600,000 people are admitted into state and federal prisons across the United States every single year. That is more than 1,600 human beings every day. Each one of them arrives at that facility carrying the same invisible weight, the understanding that the life they lived before those gates closed is over. What begins now is something entirely different. Something that no courtroom, no sentencing hearing, no legal briefing fully prepares you for. The moment a new inmate steps off that bus is called reception. But there is nothing welcoming about it. At Angola, the Louisiana State Penitentiary, one of the largest maximum security prisons in the country, reception begins with a full strip search, a medical screening, and a classification interview that will determine where you live, who you live near, and how much danger you are in from that point forward. Angola sits on 18,000 acres of former plantation land in the Mississippi River Delta. The same soil that enslaved men worked before the Civil War is the same soil that incarcerated men have worked for generations since. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, Angola has housed inmates serving life sentences at one of the highest rates in the nation, with some men spending 40 or even 50 years inside without ever being released. For a man arriving at Angola for the first time, the scale of the place alone is disorienting. There are no tall concrete towers blocking the horizon like in the movies. There is just land. Flat, endless land stretching in every direction, surrounded by the river on three sides. The message it sends is clear without a word being spoken. There is nowhere to go. Darren B., whose case was documented through Louisiana court records and a 2019 investigative report by The Advocate, arrived at Angola at the age of 19 after receiving a life sentence. In later testimony, he described his first hours inside as a kind of slow-motion shock. Not the explosion of violence he expected, but something quieter and in many ways more terrifying, the absolute erasure of his identity. His clothes were taken. His name became a number. Every decision about his body, when to eat, when to sleep, when to move, was transferred to someone else entirely. This process has a clinical name in criminology. Researchers call it mortification of the self, a term first developed by sociologist Irving Goffman to describe how total institutions systematically strip individuals of the personal identity markers they use to navigate the world. Prisons do this by design. The uniform, the number, the rigid schedule, the removal of choice. According to studies published in the American Journal of Public Health, this process begins within the first 24 to 72 hours and has measurable psychological effects that can last long after a person is released, if they are ever released at all. But for the men who survive, who truly survive, something else happens in those first hours too. They begin to watch. Veteran inmates inside Angola and facilities like it describe the first days as a critical intelligence gathering period. You learn who controls which section of the yard. You learn which officers enforce the rules and which ones create their own. You learn which spaces are dangerous at which times of day. You learn the rhythms of a place that operates like a city, with its own underground economy running on ramen noodles, postage stamps, and commissary goods that can be traded, gifted, or used as currency for protection. A 2018 Human Rights Watch report documented the widespread use of informal inmate economies across American prisons, noting that in facilities where official programming had been cut due to budget constraints, underground economies often filled the social structure left behind. In some facilities, the commissary economy was sophisticated enough to include credit systems, debt collection, and consequences for non-payment that the official prison administration had no visibility into whatsoever. For a new arrival, navigating this invisible economy without the right guidance is one of the most dangerous challenges they face. Debts accumulate fast. Misunderstandings escalate faster. And in a place where the formal grievance system is documented to be deeply ineffective, a 2021 ACLU report found that the vast majority of prison grievance filings result in no action. The informal systems of justice are often the only ones that function at all. And then there is the question of alliances. In facilities like Pelican Bay, Rikers Island, and Corcoran State Prison in California, The pressure on new inmates to affiliate with a racial or gang-based group begins almost immediately. According to testimony collected by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation during investigations into security housing unit placement practices, many inmates described being told within their first week that neutrality was not an option. You aligned, or you became a target for everyone. This is the world that 1.9 million Americans wake up inside every day. And this is only day one. By the time the lights go out on that first night, a man has already made dozens of decisions that will shape the rest of his time inside. Some of those decisions will protect him. Some will follow him for years. And some, as we will see in the chapters ahead, will define the difference between survival and something far worse. The question is not whether the system is designed to break you. The documented evidence makes clear that for many, it is. The question is what happens to the ones it fails to break. Open Book Chapter 2. The hierarchy, who rules inside. Power in an American maximum security prison does not belong to the warden. That is not an opinion. It is a conclusion drawn by researchers, federal investigators, and correctional officers themselves, people who have spent decades working inside these institutions and who will tell you, often off the record, that the official chain of command is only one layer of a much more complex structure. Beneath it runs something older, more adaptive, and in many ways more effective at maintaining order and inflicting violence than anything the administration controls. To understand how men survive inside the most dangerous prisons in America, you must first understand who actually holds power and why. The hierarchy inside a maximum security facility is not random. It did not emerge from chaos. It evolved over decades, across facilities, shaped by violence and necessity into a system that functions with remarkable consistency from one end of the country to the other. According to a 2016 report by the National Institute of Justice, prison gangs, formerly classified as security threat groups by most state departments of correction, exist in virtually every major adult correctional facility in the United States. Researchers estimate that between 15% and 25% of the total prison population has some affiliation with an organized group, though experts note the actual number is likely higher because many affiliations go undetected or unreported. These groups did not begin as criminal enterprises. Many of them began as something far more human, as protection. In the early 1950s, a group of black inmates at San Quentin State Prison in California formed an informal alliance to defend themselves against racial violence that correctional staff did nothing to prevent. That alliance would eventually evolve through decades of institutional pressure, violence, and administrative crackdown into one of the most documented prison organizations in American history. The story of that evolution is not a story of criminality alone. It is a story of what happens when a population is systematically denied protection and left to build its own. This pattern repeated itself across racial and ethnic lines throughout the 1960s and 1970s, as documented extensively in the California Department of Corrections' own historical records. White inmates formed protective alliances. Latino inmates, many of them from Southern California neighborhoods, coalesced into groups that would later be documented by federal law enforcement as having influence extending well beyond prison walls. Each group formed in response to the same fundamental condition. Inside these facilities, without an alliance, you were alone. And being alone was dangerous. By the time the prison population explosion of the 1980s and 1990s filled American facilities to record capacity, a period during which the U.S. prison population grew by more than 500% according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the informal hierarchy had become deeply entrenched. New arrivals weren't just entering a prison. They were entering a political landscape. Dwayne H., whose story was documented through federal court record from a 2009 civil rights lawsuit in California, arrived at Corcoran State Prison in the late 1990s with no gang affiliation and no intention of acquiring one. He was, by his own testimony in those proceedings, determined to do his time quietly and get out. Within his first month, he had been approached 4 times by different groups, each time with a version of the same message. Choose a side. Not choosing was itself a choice, and it was the most dangerous one available. His account is consistent with patterns documented across multiple facilities. A 1999 Human Rights Watch report titled Red Onion State Prison, Supermaximum Security Confinement in Virginia described nearly identical dynamics, noting that new inmates without affiliations were frequently targeted by multiple groups simultaneously, each testing the new arrival's willingness to resist or comply. The violence used in these tests was rarely random. It was deliberate, calibrated, designed to produce a specific result. What the official prison administration often missed, and what researchers have documented extensively, is that the hierarchy served a function that the institution itself was failing to provide. In facilities where programming had been gutted, where educational opportunities had been eliminated, where the ratio of correctional officers to inmates made genuine supervision impossible, the gang structure provided something that human beings in any environment will seek out. Predictability. Structure. A set of rules that, however brutal, were consistently enforced. A landmark 2003 study published in the journal Criminology examined inmate social structures across several California prisons and found that in facilities with stronger informal hierarchies, rates of random spontaneous violence were actually lower than in facilities where no dominant structure existed. The violence that did occur was more organized, more purposeful, and more connected to the enforcement of the informal code, which meant it was, in a grim and counterintuitive way, more predictable. And in a dangerous environment, predictability is a form of safety. For the men trying to survive without joining any group, and they existed in every facility across every era, the challenge was navigating that hierarchy without becoming a casualty of it. This required a level of social intelligence that few environments on Earth demand so urgently. You had to know when to speak and when to stay silent, when to meet someone's eyes and when to look away, which favors could be accepted without creating obligation, which obligations, once created, could never be escaped. Some men managed it through sheer reputation, prior history, physical presence, or demonstrated willingness to defend themselves that made targeting them more costly than it was worth. Others managed it through usefulness, skills, knowledge, or access to resources that made them valuable to multiple groups without being owned by any one of them. A man who could read legal documents, file appeals, or navigate the grievance system had something that transcended gang politics. Knowledge, inside a maximum security prison, was its own form of currency, and some men managed it through something harder to define, a quality that correctional staff, researchers, and fellow inmates all describe using variations of the same word. Stillness, not passivity, not weakness, something closer to what a combat veteran might recognize, the ability to remain calm and deliberate in an environment designed to provoke reaction, to absorb pressure without breaking, to be fully present in a situation without being consumed by it. It was not a quality you could fake for long. The men around you had nothing but time to study you. They would know. But for the ones who had it, genuinely had it, it changed everything. Because in a world built on the performance of power, a man who didn't need to perform, it was something the hierarchy had no easy category for. And that, as we will see, created both danger and opportunity in equal measure. Solitary, the prison within the prison. There is a place inside many American prisons that even the most hardened inmates fear. It is not the yard, where violence is visible and at least carries the logic of conflict. It is not the general population cell blocks, where danger is constant but human contact, however brutal, still exists. It is a place that has been described in federal court filings, psychiatric evaluations, and United Nations reports using language that most people associate with torture chambers in foreign countries rather than correctional facilities funded by American taxpayers. It is called the Security Housing Unit, the SHU, the hole, the box. And for tens of thousands of Americans, it is where years, sometimes decades, of their lives simply vanish. To understand what solitary confinement actually does to a human being, you have to first understand what it takes away. Not the obvious things: movement, sunlight, contact. Those are the measurable deprivations. What solitary takes at a deeper level is something that most people never think about because they have never had to. It takes away the constant low-level social calibration that every human nervous system depends on to function. The 1,000 tiny interactions per day that tell your brain where you are in the world, who you are in relation to others, and whether you are safe. Strip those away completely. For 22, 23, sometimes 24 hours a day, in a concrete room smaller than a standard parking space, and the brain begins to do something that neurologists and psychiatrists have now documented with clinical precision. It begins to generate its own stimulation, not in a healthy way, in a desperate, compensatory way that manifests in hallucinations, paranoia, obsessive thought loops, uncontrolled rage, and a profound dissociation from reality that researchers at the University of California have described as functionally indistinguishable from the symptoms of severe mental illness, even in individuals who had no prior psychiatric history before entering isolation. Dr. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School who conducted landmark studies on solitary confinement beginning in the 1980s, documented a specific psychiatric syndrome that emerged in isolated inmates, characterized by hypersensitivity to stimuli, perceptual distortions, paranoia, and what he described as a confusional state that could become permanent with prolonged exposure. His findings were later cited in federal court proceedings, including a landmark California case that challenged the constitutionality of long-term SHU placement at Pelican Bay State Prison. Todd Ashker was one of the lead plaintiffs in that case. Ashker arrived at Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit in 1990 and remained there for over 2 decades. His case, documented extensively through court filings in Ashker versus Governor of California, became one of the most significant legal challenges to solitary confinement in American history. Ashker and fellow SHU inmates described conditions in which they spent 22.5 hours per day in a windowless concrete cell measuring approximately 80 square feet. The remaining 90 minutes were spent in what was called the dog run, a slightly larger concrete enclosure with a single opening to the sky, designed to allow exercise without visual contact with other inmates. Ashker did not break, but he documented, in meticulous detail collected over years of legal correspondence, what happened to the men around him who did. Men who had entered the SHU functional and left it unable to hold a conversation. Men who spent years talking to walls. Men who inflicted injuries upon themselves not from a desire to die but from a desperate need to feel something other than the absolute sensory blankness of a concrete room. According to the Center for Constitutional Rights, which represented Ashker and his co-plaintiffs, some inmates at Pelican Bay had been held in the SHU for more than 40 consecutive years at the time the lawsuit was filed in 2012. 40 years, in a room smaller than a parking space. The lawsuit resulted in a landmark 2015 settlement that prohibited California from placing inmates in the SHU solely based on gang affiliation, the practice that had kept Ashker and thousands of others in isolation indefinitely, and mandated the release of hundreds of long-term SHU inmates into general population. It was a legal victory of enormous significance, but for many of the men finally released, the damage was already done. Researchers at the Association of State Correctional Administrators and the Lyman Center for Public Interest Law at Yale Law School conducted a nationwide study published in 2016 that documented the use of solitary confinement across all 50 states. They found that approximately 67,000 people were held in some form of restrictive housing on any given day, a number that human rights advocates argued was a significant undercount due to inconsistent reporting standards across state systems. The same study found that inmates with serious mental illness were disproportionately represented in solitary confinement populations, despite decades of documented evidence that isolation dramatically worsens psychiatric conditions. This created a cycle that federal investigators have described as one of the most troubling patterns in the American correctional system. A mentally ill inmate placed in solitary deteriorates. Their deterioration produces behaviors that correctional staff classify as rule violations. Those rule violations result in extended time in isolation. The extended isolation produces further deterioration. The cycle continues, sometimes for years, without any clinical intervention capable of interrupting it. Robert Feliciano's case illustrated this pattern with painful clarity. His story, documented through New York State Court records and an investigation by the New York Times published in 2014, described a young man with a diagnosed mental illness who entered Rikers Island and was placed in solitary after a series of altercations with staff. Over the following months, his psychiatric condition deteriorated sharply inside isolation. His behavior escalated. His isolation was extended. By the time medical staff intervened with anything resembling adequate psychiatric care, he had spent the better part of a year in a condition that his own treatment team later described, in court testimony, as a preventable psychiatric crisis. Feliciano's case was not an anomaly. The same New York Times investigation documented systemic failures in mental health care across New York City's jail system, findings that contributed to the Department of Justice's subsequent investigation and the federal oversight agreement that followed. For inmates without mental illness, the damage was different, but no less real. Men who had entered solitary physically healthy and psychologically stable described, in testimony collected across multiple court cases and human rights investigations, a process of internal restructuring that occurred simply as a survival mechanism. You learn to stop expecting anything. You learn to flatten your emotional range, because feeling too much in a space that offered nothing was its own form of suffering. You learn to live in a kind of suspended state that allowed you to endure the hours, then the days, then the weeks without being consumed by them. Some men described it as a form of mental discipline that produced unexpected clarity. In the complete absence of external distraction, they read voraciously, studied law, developed legal strategies that eventually produced real results in court. Todd Ashker himself, who had a limited formal education, became sufficiently versed in constitutional law through years of solitary study to coordinate a class action lawsuit that ultimately changed policy for thousands of California inmates. Others described it as simply learning to disappear inside themselves, to locate some interior space that the institution could not reach, and to live there, quietly, for as long as it took. But even those who found ways to survive the psychological assault of isolation carried something out of it that never fully left. A heightened vigilance, a difficulty with unstructured time, a reaction to open spaces and background noise that people who have never been isolated cannot easily understand. The outside world, for men who have spent years in a 7 by 12-foot cell, does not feel like freedom when they finally return to it. It feels overwhelming, unpredictable, and profoundly disorienting. This is the cost of solitary confinement that no sentencing document accounts for, that no judge weighs at the moment of conviction, that no policy debate fully reckons with. You can survive it. Some men do. But survival, in this case, is not the same as coming out whole. Violence, the economy of fear. Violence in an American maximum security prison is rarely what television makes it look like. It is not always explosive. It is not always loud. It is not always the sudden eruption that ends in blood on a concrete floor while guards scramble and alarms wail. More often, according to correctional researchers, former inmates, and the documented patterns recorded across decades of federal investigations, violence inside these facilities functions less like an explosion and more like a weather system. Something that builds, shifts, and moves according to pressures that anyone paying close enough attention can read. And the men who survive longest are almost always the ones who learn to read it early. That does not make it less lethal. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, between 2001 and 2019, more than 7,000 state and federal inmates died from homicide inside American correctional facilities. That number does not capture the full scale of violence. It counts only the deaths. It does not count the thousands of assaults, stabbings, and beatings that left men alive but permanently damaged. It does not count the injuries that were never formally reported, because reporting an assault inside a maximum security prison carries its own dangers, the label of informant being among the most lethal a person can carry in that environment. A 2018 report by the Bureau of Justice Statistics documented that in state prisons alone, there were approximately 200 inmate-on-inmate assault per 1,000 inmates annually, a rate that, if applied to any American city, would represent a public health emergency of the highest order. Inside prison, it is documented, studied, and largely accepted as a condition of confinement. The economy of fear, As researchers, correctional staff, and inmates themselves have described it across multiple investigations, operates on a simple principle. The perception of danger is as powerful as danger itself. A man who is believed to be capable of lethal violence, regardless of whether he has ever actually committed it inside the facility, occupies a fundamentally different position in the prison ecosystem than a man who is not. This perception is managed, cultivated, and sometimes manufactured. The tattoos serve a communicative function that goes beyond identity. The reputation precedes the person, and the reputation, in many cases, is what keeps the person alive. Michael Santos, a former federal inmate who served 26 years in multiple facilities including USP Atlanta and USP Lompoc, documented this dynamic extensively in his writing following his release. His accounts, which drew on direct experience inside some of the most volatile federal institutions in the country, describe a constant low-level calculation that every inmate engage in every day, an assessment of threat levels, alliance shifts, and the meaning of small behavioral signals that an outside observer would never notice but that, inside the institution, carried enormous significance. Santos described how the movement of groups across the yard, the seating arrangements in the dining hall, the presence or absence of specific individuals at specific times, all of these were data points that experienced inmates read continuously. When the data shifted in particular ways, violence was coming. Not maybe. When? The only variables were where, who, and whether you could position yourself to not be in the way when it arrived. The weapons used in prison violence are almost never the weapons of the outside world. They are improvised from the limited materials available, and the ingenuity involved, documented in reports by the National Institute of Corrections, is a grim testament to human adaptability. A sharpened piece of metal extracted from a bed frame. A razor blade melted into the end of a toothbrush. A combination lock placed inside a sock. These items, referred to in correctional documentation as shanks and impact weapons, are manufactured, hidden, traded, and deployed in a context where their primary purpose is often not actual violence but the credible threat of it. Because the threat, in most cases, is enough. The case of a California inmate referred to in court documents from a 2007 federal civil rights case as James R. illustrated this dynamic with painful precision. James had entered a California state prison with no prior history of institutional violence. Within his first year, according to court testimony, he had been involved in 3 separate incidents, none of which he initiated, all of which correctional investigators later concluded were responses to threats against his physical safety that the institution had failed to address through official channels. By the time his case reached federal court, he was serving additional years for conduct that his own legal team successfully argued had been a direct consequence of the institution's failure to provide the protection it was legally obligated to provide. His case was not unique. A 2020 report by the ACLU documented widespread patterns of correctional staff failing to intervene in situations where imminent violence was foreseeable, and in some documented instances, actively allowing or facilitating inmate-on-inmate violence as a tool of informal population management. This practice, sometimes referred to in investigative reporting in court documents as gladiator fights, was documented most extensively in connection with Corcoran State Prison in California, where a federal grand jury investigation in the 1990s found that correctional officers had arranged and bet on fights between rival inmates. Several officers were indicted. The institutional culture that enabled those practices took years of federal oversight to begin to dismantle, and some investigators argued it was never fully dismantled at all. For the men navigating this environment every day, the psychological weight of sustained threat is itself a form of violence. Researchers studying post-traumatic stress disorder in formerly incarcerated populations have found rates of PTSD that are comparable to those documented in combat veterans. A 2014 study published in the American Journal of Public Health found that formerly incarcerated individuals reported PTSD symptoms at rates 4 times higher than the general population, with rates among those who had experienced violence inside prison significantly higher still. The men who survived the violence, not just physically but psychologically, developed what researchers have called hypervigilance as an adaptive response, a constant state of environmental scanning. an inability to sit with their back to a room, a startle response calibrated to an environment where a sound out of place could mean seconds to respond. These adaptations kept people alive inside. Outside, they became symptoms. They became barriers to employment, to relationships, to the ordinary navigation of a world that did not require that level of alertness to survive. This is the inheritance of violence inside American prisons. Not just the injuries sustained, but the rewiring that survival required. And for the men who made it through, who absorbed the threat, managed the calculation, and emerged on the other side of their sentences intact, the question waiting for them was one that no correctional system had prepared them to answer. How do you turn the hypervigilance off? The ones who fought back, legal warriors and hunger strikes. On July 8, 2013, something happened inside the California prison system that had never happened before at that scale. Inmates at Pelican Bay State Prison, men who had been held in the security housing unit for years, many of them for decades, with virtually no ability to coordinate or communicate across the walls of their individual cells, launched a hunger strike. They did not do it spontaneously. They had been planning it, through handwritten legal correspondence passed through attorneys, for months. Within 4 days, according to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's own reporting, the hunger strike had spread beyond Pelican Bay. By the end of the first week, inmates at facilities across the state of California were refusing food in solidarity. The numbers continued to climb. At its peak, by the second week of the strike, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation officially acknowledged that approximately 30,000 inmates across the California state prison system were refusing meals. 30,000 people, coordinated, organized, disciplined, without smartphones, without email, without any of the communications infrastructure that outside organizers take for granted. This was not a riot. There was no violence. There was no property destruction. There was simply the collective refusal to participate in the system's most basic transaction, the provision of food in exchange for compliance, carried out simultaneously across dozens of facilities by men who had decided that the conditions of their confinement was something they were no longer willing to endure in silence. The 2013 hunger strike was the second major action organized by the Pelican Bay SHU inmates. The first had occurred in 2011, also drawing thousands of participants before ending with state officials making commitments to review SHU placement policies, commitments that the inmate organizers documented as largely unfulfilled, which was part of what drove the 2013 action. The demands were specific and documented. The Short Corridor Collective, the name given to the coordinating group of Pelican Bay SHU inmates, named for the corridor of cells they occupied, had articulated 5 core demands in written form that they distributed through their attorneys and to human rights organizations. They wanted an end to group punishment. They wanted the ability to have family photos in their cells. They wanted adequate food. They wanted rehabilitation programming. And most centrally, they wanted an end to the indeterminate SHU sentences that kept men in isolation for years based not on anything they had done inside the facility, but on their suspected gang affiliation alone. These were not radical demands. Read in isolation. They sound like the minimum standard of humane treatment, but they had been ignored for years. And so the men who had been ignored chose the only instrument they had available to them, their own bodies. The 2013 strike lasted 60 days, making it the longest coordinated prisoner hunger strike in California history. By the time it ended, 4 inmates had been taken off the strike by court order due to life-threatening medical deterioration. Hundreds had lost significant weight. None of the striking inmates had been given anything that could be called an adequate response from the administration during the strike itself. But what the strike accomplished was something different and in some ways more durable. It forced a national conversation about solitary confinement that had not existed at that scale before. It brought journalists, human rights organizations, and eventually legislators into a debate that the California Department of Corrections had successfully kept out of public view for decades. And it provided the moral and political foundation for the Attica versus Governor of California lawsuit, the class action case that ultimately produced the 2015 settlement ending indeterminate SHU placement based on gang affiliation. This pattern of incarcerated people using legal mechanisms and collective action as tools of resistance runs through the history of American prison reform in ways that are rarely acknowledged in public discourse about criminal justice. The Attica Uprising of September 1971 is the most documented example, when approximately 1,300 inmates at Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York took control of the prison yard and forced cell blocks, holding 42 staff members as hostages. They did so with a set of written demands that have since been studied by legal scholars, historians, and correctional researchers for the precision with which they identified systemic failures. The Attica inmates demanded access to adequate medical care, religious freedom, an end to what they described as brutal and arbitrary punishment by correctional staff, and genuine rehabilitation programming. They negotiated through a committee of outside observers that included journalists and civil rights attorneys. The New York State Commission on Attica, convened in the aftermath of the uprising, later found that many of the inmates' core complaints were factually substantiated. The conditions they had described, inadequate medical care, arbitrary punishment, racial discrimination, were real. The Commission's report, published in 1972 under the title Attica, the official report, remains one of the most detailed official examinations of American prison conditions ever produced. The uprising ended on September 13, 1971, when Governor Nelson Rockefeller ordered state police to retake the facility by force. In the assault that followed, 33 inmates and 10 correctional officer hostages were killed, all of them by gunfire from state police. Not a single one of the hostages who died was killed by inmates. Every hostage death was the result of state action. This finding, documented in the official commission report and confirmed by subsequent investigations, was initially obscured by official statements claiming that hostages had been killed by inmates, statements that were later proven false. The legal aftermath of Attica produced settlements and reforms that reshaped New York's correctional system over the following decades. But the men who died in that yard, and the conditions that drove them to take the actions they took, remained largely absent from the public narrative that followed. Beyond collective action, individual legal battles have shaped the landscape of American prison rights in ways that are rarely attributed to the men who fought them. Inmates filing their own legal briefs, often with no legal training beyond what they had acquired through years of self-directed study in prison law libraries, have been plaintiffs in cases that establish foundational constitutional protections. The Eighth Amendment protections against cruel and unusual punishment that govern prison conditions today were built, case by case, appeal by appeal, substantially on the legal work of incarcerated people who had nothing but time, determination, and access to a law library. These were not fearless men in the sense that they felt no fear. By every account, in their own words, in court testimony, in the documentation of what they risked, they understood exactly what resistance cost inside these institutions. Solitary confinement, loss of good time credits, institutional retaliation that could add years to a sentence or make daily life inside the facility significantly more dangerous. They did it anyway, not because the odds favored them, but because the alternative, absolute silence in the face of documented injustice, was something they had concluded was no longer possible. And in doing so, they changed the institutions that had tried to disappear them. After the gates open, the cost of survival. The gate opens for a man who has spent years, sometimes decades, inside a maximum security prison. The moment of release is not what most people imagine it to be. There is no slow-motion walk into sunlight. There is no music. There is, in many cases, a plastic bag containing the clothes you arrived in, which may no longer fit, may no longer be in fashion by a decade or more, may belong to a version of yourself that ceased to exist somewhere in the years between then and now. There is a bus ticket to the county of your last known residence. There is, in most states, between $20 and $200 in gate money, a sum that researchers at the Vera Institute of Justice have described as wholly inadequate for the basic requirements of reentry into civilian life. And there is the world, unfiltered, loud, moving at a speed and complexity that a person calibrated to the rhythms of an institution is profoundly unprepared for. This gap between the environment that incarcerated people have learned to survive and the environment they are released into is one of the least examined aspects of American criminal justice. It receives far less policy attention than the question of how people end up in prison in the first place, and far less public concern than the violence that occurs inside. But according to the data, it is where many of the most consequential outcomes of mass incarceration are determined. The numbers are stark. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, approximately 2/3 of people released from state prisons are rearrested within 3 years. Within 5 years, that figure rises to approximately 3/4. These statistics are frequently cited in policy debates as evidence of individual failure, proof that incarcerated people are inherently recidivistic, fundamentally unable to change. What those debates rarely examine is what the research consistently shows about the structural conditions that produce those outcomes. A man released from a maximum security facility in most American states faces a set of overlapping barriers that researchers have described as creating a virtually inescapable cycle. In many states, a felony conviction permanently or for extended periods disqualifies a person from public housing, meaning that a man with nowhere else to go and $50 in his pocket is legally barred from the one form of subsidized shelter his financial situation might otherwise qualify him for. In most states, a felony conviction creates significant barriers to employment, with surveys consistently showing that employers dramatically reduce their willingness to hire individuals with criminal records, regardless of the nature of the offense or the time elapsed since release. Damon Williams, whose story was documented through a 2017 investigative series by the Marshall Project, left a California state prison after serving 14 years with the clothing on his back, a bus ticket, and $200. He had a felony conviction that disqualified him from public housing. He had been out of the workforce for 14 years in an economy that had been transformed by technology he had no access to inside. He had no credit history, no recent references, no bank account. He had, however, built something inside that many people in his position do not: a skill. Years of self-directed study had made him capable enough in legal research that he had assisted other inmates with their cases. But that skill had no recognized credential attached to it. No certificate, no degree, nothing that translated into the language of a job application. His first night out, he slept in a shelter. His first week, he spent trying to navigate a benefit system that had changed significantly since his conviction. His story, and the stories of thousands of men like him documented across multiple investigative projects, illustrates a fundamental truth about American criminal justice that the recidivism statistics obscure. The system releases people into conditions almost perfectly calibrated to produce failure, then points to that failure as evidence that incarceration was the correct response in the first place. For the men who had survived the most dangerous prisons, who had navigated the hierarchy, endured solitary, absorbed the violence, and used legal mechanisms to fight back against conditions that courts had in some cases agreed were unconstitutional, the challenge of reentry represented a different but equally formidable test. The skills that had kept them alive inside were, in many cases, liabilities outside. The hypervigilance that had been a survival mechanism in a maximum security yard was now a source of anxiety in a grocery store. The ability to read threat and small behavioral signals, a skill that had been essential inside, produced a constant sense of danger in environments that were, by any objective measure, safe. The flattening of emotional expression that had protected men in an environment where showing vulnerability invited predation now made it difficult to form the close relationships that reintegration required. Dr. Reginald Dwayne Betts, a poet and attorney who served 8 years in Virginia prisons beginning at the age of 16 and went on to earn a law degree from Yale University, has written and spoken extensively about this particular form of damage. His account, documented in his memoir, A Question of Freedom, and in subsequent public lectures and legal work, described the process of learning to inhabit the outside world again as something that required as much deliberate effort as anything he had done to survive inside. The body, he explained, had been trained to respond to one environment. Retraining it for another was not automatic. It required recognition, intention, and time, and it required the structural support systems that the American reentry system largely fails to provide. The men who succeed in reentry, and they exist in numbers that the recidivism statistics tend to obscure, almost universally describe the same factors as determinative. Not individual willpower alone, not moral transformation alone, concrete structural support, housing that was stable, employment that was accessible, a mentor or community connection that bridged the gap between the institution and the outside, access to mental health services that understood the specific psychological profile of someone returning from long-term incarceration. In time, simply time, without immediate catastrophic consequence while the nervous system recalibrated. These factors are not mysteries. They are documented in decades of Reentry research produced by institutions ranging from the Urban Institute to the Rand Corporation to the National Institute of Justice. The interventions that reduce recidivism are known. They have been studied, tested, and verified. The question is not what works. The question, and it is a political question, not a scientific one, is whether the American public and the institutions that represent it are willing to invest in providing those conditions to people who have been convicted of crimes. That question remains unanswered. But for the individual men whose stories have run through this documentary, the ones who survived Pelican Bay's SHU, who endured Angola's decades-long sentences, who organized across the walls of California's prisons to demand human treatment, who filed lawsuits from solitary cells and built legal arguments from law library textbooks with no formal training. The answer they eventually lived is more complicated than either a success story or cautionary tale. It is the story of what happens to a human being who is placed inside one of the most extreme environments on Earth, who develops every capability necessary to survive it, and who is then released into a world that has no category for what they have become. Some of them built new lives with the same deliberate discipline they had used to survive. Some of them went back. Some of them are still navigating the distance between who the prison made them and who they were trying to become. And some of them, the ones who organized, who filed, who struck, who refused, changed the institutions that held them. Not completely, not finally, but measurably, in ways that the men held in those facilities today live with every day, even if they do not know who to thank for it. That, in the end, is what survival at the highest level looks like inside the American prison system. Not just enduring the institution, but leaving it different than you found it. The gates closed behind them. The question the system never asks, and perhaps never once answered, is what exactly it has created in the years between the first gate and the last. Because whatever it is walking among us now, and it deserves a reckoning.